Think about this for a second. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union was one of two global superpowers. I mean, this was a nuclear-armed behemoth that stretched across 11 time zones. And then, in what felt like the blink of an eye, it just vanished from the map. So how does an empire that basically defined the 20th century collapse so fast and so completely? All right, let's get into it.
The whole story, believe it or not, kinda starts with these two men. On the right, you've got US President Ronald Reagan, the guy who famously called the Soviet Union an evil empire. And on the left, the new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. This first meeting they had in 1985 kicked off what would become a surprisingly effective partnership, and it really set the stage for everything that was about to unfold.
So, to really get why this meeting was such a big deal, you have to understand the mess the Soviet Union was in when Gorbachev came to power. I mean, from the outside, yeah, it looked like a military giant. But underneath that tough exterior, the empire was basically rotting from the inside out.
Gorbachev basically inherited a country facing two enormous crises at the exact same time. First, the economy was a total disaster. You had these central planners trying to guess what millions of people needed, and they were failing miserably. Store shelves were empty, production was tanking, and at the same time, the US, under Reagan, was in the middle of this massive military buildup. The Soviets, with their broken economy, they just couldn't keep up, financially or technologically. The whole system was teetering on the brink of collapse.
So, Gorbachev decides to make this huge gamble. And this is so important to understand. His goal wasn't to tear down the Soviet Union. It was a desperate, last-ditch effort to reform it, to save it from itself. And his plan had two really radical parts.
First up was perestroika, which means economic restructuring. The whole idea was to inject a little bit of free market thinking into this stagnant, state-run economy. By letting industries make more of their own decisions, Gorbachev was hoping that factories might finally start making things that people actually wanted to buy.
But to get people to go along with all these painful economic changes, he knew he needed the second part of his plan, glasnost, or political openness. This meant allowing more debate, more criticism, and just more public involvement in general. For the first time in, decades, a Soviet leader was actually asking the people for their opinion. He was, in effect, opening Pandora's box.
Now, for any of this to work, Gorbachev had to solve one gigantic problem. The arms race was literally bankrupting his country. He couldn't afford perestroika while trying to match every dollar the US spent on its military. So taming the arms race wasn't just about peace, it was an economic necessity. He went all in on arms control talks, and that led to these landmark deals like the INF and START treaties. This helped slash military spending and, critically, freed up resources for his reforms back home. But here's where the unintended consequences start to kick in, and they were massive. As Gorbachev was trying to fix things at the center of the empire, the edges started to unravel. The revolution he'd started at home was about to spill over in a big way.
And this right here, this is the absolute key. Gorbachev made a stunning break from the past. He made it clear that unlike all the Soviet leaders before him, he was not going to send in the tanks to crush protests in the satellite states of Eastern Europe. He actually saw those communist regimes as a drain on his economy, not as some great strategic prize. For reformers all over the region, this was a giant green light.
And the speed of what happened next is just breathtaking. The year 1989 was a total whirlwind. In June, Poland's Solidarity movement wins in free elections. Come September, Hungary literally punches a hole in the Iron Curtain by opening its border. By the time the year was out, one communist government after another had fallen, sometimes peacefully, like in Czechoslovakia, sometimes violently, like in Romania. The dominoes were falling faster than anyone could possibly have imagined.
And right at the heart of this divided continent stood the ultimate symbol of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall. Just 2 years before it all came crashing down, President Reagan stood right here at the Brandenburg Gate, and he threw down a challenge that, at the time, just seemed impossible.
It's just incredible to hear that now. Back in 1987, most people saw these words as, just political theater. Nobody seriously dreamed that the wall, this thing of concrete and barbed wire that had defined life for decades, would ever actually come down. And then, on this date, the impossible happened. In the middle of all these mass protests and a lot of confusion, the East German authorities suddenly opened the checkpoints. The Berlin Wall, the very symbol of the Iron Curtain, basically just ceased to exist overnight. So the collapse of the Outer Empire in Eastern Europe was just stunning. But now, the very same forces that Gorbachev had unleashed were coming home. The revolution was turning inward, and it was about to devour its creator.
And this is the great central irony of this whole story. Glasnost, the policy of openness that was supposed to get people on board with saving the Soviet Union, ended up doing the exact opposite. It gave a voice to decades of nationalism that had been brutally suppressed within the USSR's own 15 republics, from the Baltics all the way to Central Asia. And this all led to a dramatic power struggle for the country's future. On one side, you have Gorbachev, desperately trying to control the pace of change and just hold the Union together. And on the other, you've got Boris Yeltsin, this charismatic populist leader of the Russian Republic, who is pushing for way more radical democracy and more power for the individual republics.
It all came to a head in August of 1991. Communist hardliners, who were just terrified of all these changes, they launched a coup, and they put Gorbachev under house arrest. But then Boris Yeltsin, in this legendary moment, climbs on top of a tank outside the Russian parliament and defies them. The coup just fell apart in 3 days, but it was the fatal blow. All the real power had now shifted to Yeltsin and the leaders of the republics, and one by one, they started declaring their independence.
And so, on Christmas Day 1991, it was officially over. Mikhail Gorbachev went on television and resigned as president of the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics, a country that really had already stopped existing. The red hammer and sickle flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the very last time.
But the end of the Soviet Union wasn't the end of the story. Its collapse didn't solve everything. In fact, it created a totally new, fractured world, and it left behind a really complex and often a very violent legacy.
And this is what was left. Where there was once this one massive country, there were now many. A huge chunk of the globe splintered into all these new independent nations, and every single one of them had to figure out its own path in this new world.
15. That was the final count. One superpower became 15 new sovereign states, each with its own history, its own culture, and now its own future to deal with.
But that breakup was messy, really messy. See, the Soviets had this policy of divide and rule, where they drew the borders of their republics in a way that deliberately cut right across ethnic lines. So once the strong central power in Moscow was gone, all these old tensions just exploded into wars that have haunted the region for decades since, in places like Chechnya, Georgia, and of course, most consequentially, in Ukraine.
So when you really step back and look at the whole thing, the great irony is that the one man who tried to reform and save the Soviet superpower ended up being the one who oversaw its end. His attempt to fix a broken system just made it fall apart even faster. And it leaves you with this really big question. What does this story tell us about just how fragile empires really are?